Hey everybody, welcome to another one of Samson's live mailbag Saturday things. Today, an episode where I'm joined by longtime, not co-host, but longtime guest, friend of the show, Joe Wolfond. First time in the new format. I believe I've achieved what the kids call a score by getting both the Joes on from the score. Joe, how you doing? How you feeling?
I feel great. I've been out of the podcast game for a few months,
Mm,
so maybe a little out of practice, but also very excited to be doing it because I haven't gotten an opportunity to do that very often this season. And this past week was a tough one to
mhm.
be out of the podcast game. I was like itching to get back in the saddle. So great to be here for that reason. And always great to be talking hoops with you. So
Because I had been after I had Joe on for the episode last month, there were many people who said, like, "Can you get Joe and Joe on for a trade deadline episode?" And I was like, "They'll both have duties for trade deadline stuff, but
yeah.
at the very least, I can get Joe on afterwards." And what's that been like so far? Is it like more writing work? Are you getting to dive deep into some of the things that maybe you wouldn't have got to otherwise?
Yeah, I mean it was always synced up pretty nicely
Hmm.
with the writing that I was doing because a lot of times, like whether it was me or Cash, if we were doing a deep dive on some particular team or some topic, we would usually just wind up having the
Yeah.
conversation about it on the podcast. And there were also times when, we would have a podcast discussion that might take us in a particular direction, and that would give us ideas for things to write about. So it was actually a nice marriage of the two mediums, and definitely writing a bit more, without the pod in my life. But I liked having the balance of being able to do both.
Hmm.
So I miss it, but we move.
Yeah, we do move. It's always good to be able to like have the osmosis of discussing something with someone. Like when I do the podcast with Caitlin, I walk away because we don't plan it either, really, and we
Mm.
just kind of blah about basketball. And I walk away being like, this tested the boundaries of some of my beliefs. We'll get into it right away for live listeners, for podcast listeners, for everybody. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. It helps the channel. It helps us grow bigger, which is what we're aiming to do. Today's topics are myself and Joe, of course, rehashing and addressing the post-deadline Raptors. A lot of players have left. A big name named Brandon Ingram has come in. Joe is more optimistic now than he was initially. We're going to talk about the merits of this trade. Obviously, I've been pretty optimistic from the jump. We're going to talk about the NBA-wide trends, some things that are changing, how the Raptors fit into that. We're going to talk about the objective wins that the Raptors organization has had lately. Joe, I'll let you take it first. You've got the pedestal to speak. The Brandon Ingram trade. We're a couple days out. How
Mm.
do you feel?
Yeah. So, like I told you off air, I think I am higher on it now than I was when I had my initial knee jerk reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I still think I'm probably a little bit lower on it than consensus, but I think that I'm at a point where I really understand the process behind it and don't think there's much to quibble with there. Objectively, it's great value.
Yeah,
Like you have Bruce Brown's expiring, Kelly Olynyk's, let's be honest, probably negative asset value deal,
I think so.
and a surplus first rounder that you can expect to land, maybe in like the early 20s. For a 27-year-old who's been an all-star in the recent past. Like that's a great value deal. And the other thing that I thought about, because I've seen people saying stuff like, well, this Raptors front office can't even commit to a direction for more than a few months. And like, this is just my read on the situation. Like, I don't have sources or anything like that, but it seems to me like as they were considering their options for selling, they just weren't having a lot of luck finding a team that could both or was willing to both.
Oh, your mic just cut out. If you can
Sorry,
reconnect it. There you go.
my
Yes, you
back.
got it again.
Yeah,
Yep.
I just think they weren't having a lot of luck finding a team that was willing or able to both take on Bruce's contract and send them any kind of meaningful asset back. And so I think this possibility entering the fray where instead of using Bruce's contract as like a sell, they could use it as salary ballast in a way to buy potentially undervalued talent and just get that guy in the door. So, and like all of that makes a lot of sense to me. And especially like you kind of have the ability to get off of Kelly's contract in the process. I think this has the ability to like completely salvage the Pascal trade return. If, they re-sign Ingram on a contract that is not too onerous. And and this is to me, the maybe more important consideration, if he can adapt in a way that makes him, a better on-court fit than I'm maybe anticipating him being right now. But if that happens, then this has the potential to go down as like one of the best trades in franchise history, frankly. So I think, all of that is the positive side. And again, like I said off the top, like even though this wasn't my initial reaction, upon reflection, I think even if it doesn't work out, I won't fault the front office for the process that led to the deal. Like, I think it's a worthwhile talent play.
Yeah. It's go ahead.
So that's the kind of where I'm at on the positive side of things. And then I can get into why I'm maybe a little more skeptical.
Okay. So I think it's easy to see why people were confused just initially. Like, hey, this, and especially when you have people outside, framing it as like, hey, the Raptors have now used a first round pick or traded a pick in 4 straight deadlines. And then you look at their records each year and you say, what is the direction? But I think that, the title of this podcast is The Raptors Hacked Their Rebuild. As you said, and it was kind of funny when you were speaking about Bruce, the word ballast came to my mind and then you used it. How often is that? How often do you use the word ballast?
I literally only ever use it in talking about matching up salaries in NBA trades.
There's like the linguistics or that bloggers use, and we're firmly in that. But the Raptors, I think, had the ultimate opportunity here, and you laid out exactly why. The Raptors have a significant opportunity to get significantly more talented. They have an opportunity to expedite some of the things that are happening in a rebuild, and you have an opportunity to take a game like OKC where Scottie gets doubled a lot, where Scottie doesn't get doubled that much this season. A lot of times he's facing single coverage, and it's easy to envision like, okay, not only is there a hopeful side of the Brandon Ingram trade, which we'll talk about the play style a bunch, we'll get into it, but even if it's like the floor of Brandon Ingram, there are things that he objectively improves about this team, and we'll quibble. We will, of course, quibble, but I got this text because Lewis wrote this great piece on RaptorsRepublic.com about the fit of Scottie and Ingram, and it's a pretty big sell on Ingram. And Lewis wasn't that big on the Ingram trade initially either, but he texted me late at night. He says, Ingram might be better than I thought. And there's kind of this thing with, it happened with Darius Garland, who I know you and I both have massive belief in and did. Yes. We were looking into, hey, what's happening with the jaw grip strength correlation, Yeah. And Brandon Ingram had a really bad playoff series. However, I don't think that was representative of who he is as a player. I think that's just a down thing. Let's get into it, though. We'll debate, we'll quibble. What's the downside here, Joe? And I may disagree. It might get contentious.
Let's hope so. I mean, that's interesting podcasting. So, but really, I mean, it's 3 main things, right? It's the contract, the pick, and the player himself. So I don't know which one of those 3 things do you want to start with?
The contract is the quickest and the least interesting, but maybe the most important. So for perspective or perception. So let's just do that quickly.
Yeah. So I think the big worry is you wind up re-signing him to a deal that, if things don't work out the way you hope, becomes really difficult to move in the future. And then you're just kind of stuck with a team that doesn't mesh that well, that is kind of mid, and that you don't have an easy pivot to get out of. That's really it. Because in terms of like next year, it's not going to be a cheap team. If they're able to sign him for something like $40 million a year, like let's say it's $3,120.
Sure.
That feels reasonable-ish to me. Then, yeah, just looking at Blake's comment. Then basically, like with that $40 million deal and what you're going to be paying the first round pick,
Expensive.
you're like at the tax.
Yep.
Without adding anybody, without, re-signing Boucher, anything like that. And that's with the bench being entirely made up of rookie scale guys. So that's okay. Like you can be like, at the tax, maybe a little bit below the luxury tax next season, and you roll it out and you see how it goes, and it's not the end of the world. But as you move forward, it's kind of like you just don't have a lot of maneuverability unless, and they're going to have to make decisions on this anyway, because next year is like the last year. Like Yak can opt out after next year. It's the last year of RJ's deal. So they were going to have to make decisions about how to move forward with this roster construction anyway. This might just expedite that process. And again, that is not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But if you have some misgivings about Ingram as a centerpiece type of player, the way that I do, that's when it starts to become a little frightening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I think the rebuttal then is, I don't think the other players' contracts I don't think they impact Ingram's contract that much. And honestly, because the optimist in me sees Ingram as not a player who will be in a position where you have to get off of that contract. You may pivot, but I feel that they will pivot for similar value of what they gave up, or perhaps even more. And then also we're looking at Ingram as a guy who could perhaps be potentially surplus value. I don't know if that's a super realistic outcome, but you cross your fingers for that. And as you said, I think this impacts players on the roster in a way that disaffects some players potentially, but also puts more competition on the roster. And it puts the Raptors in a quicker position of like separating the wheat from the chaff, let's say. And I actually like that for this roster. And it's something we'll talk about towards the end. But when you look at like even before the Raptors traded for Ingram, when people looked at the Pascal return, they were like, well, there's Ochai, there's Kelly, there's this pick, there's that pick. And like, this is all good. And it's like, well, we don't know if any of these guys are playoff rotation players yet. Pascal definitely is. And that's what you're trading for, really. Anytime you're in a trade, you want playoff rotation players because you want somebody who can help in a championship. But the Raptors, this helps put them in a position where it's like, okay, let's see it. And let's see it a little bit quicker. That helps a lot. And also, you pay guys in this NBA. I like Ingram. Do I think it's closer to 35 or do I think it's closer to 50? I think it's closer to 50. If I'm being honest, I think that's probably what he gets. Masai typically pays.
Sorry,
guys.
you think that's probably what he gets is closer to 50, or you think that's how you'd value him as closer to 50?
I think he'll get closer to 50. Okay. I think he'll get closer to 50. And you just listen. RJ gets 26. Pirtle gets 20 and whatever. IQ's on 32.5 flat. Scotty goes into the max. Depending on which draft slot you have, it's anywhere between 8 to 12 or 10.8 or whatever the hell. So the Raptors are put in a position to make decisions. But I want talent on this roster. That's contract. There's the good and the bad. Of course, you could, like, Zach LaVine is like a plus 60% true shooting guy year in, year out, fits in a million different teams, and the Bulls had trouble trading him. It could go sideways with the Ingram thing. Choosing to believe that it won't. So we have contract there. What's the next piece? Fit, health, etc., etc.
Yeah. So, fit, health, just like overall, Brandon Ingram, the player, the idea of him, the reality of him, all that stuff can be folded into that. The health, it's not worth spending too much time talking about because I don't have access to Brandon Ingram's medicals. I don't know how much of this is like, people talk a lot about the Pelicans medical staff and how many issues they've had over there. Bobby Webster in his press conference came out and said, I think we have the best medical staff in the league and that we're going to be able to keep him healthy. who knows? Like, yeah, Alex McKechnie in some senses has a great track record, but the Raptors have also been super injured over the last couple of years. Like, shit happens sometimes. And I don't know how much control they have over it, but it's been an issue for him. Undoubtedly, he hasn't done a great job staying on the floor in the last 4 or so seasons. But that's not super interesting to talk about. It's just a reality of his recent career, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the case moving forward, but it's something to keep in mind. In thinking about fit, I fully recognize, this is a talented shot maker. The Raptors need talented shot makers. Somebody who can create his own shot, who can shoot off the dribble, has the super high release so that he can get that shot off over almost any defender. And that's all important. I think in broad strokes, if we're talking like archetypes or just challenges with certain types of players fitting in certain environments, it's a little bit to me like the DeRozan corollary. And I know he's a better 3-point shooter than DeMar, but generally I would say he's not been an especially effective off-ball player, but I don't think he's good enough with the ball in his hands to be the centerpiece of a really good offense. And so that's the challenge there. And then defensively, I think he's had moments and stretches where he's impactful, but it's inconsistent. And on the whole, I'd say he kind of tops out around average. I'd probably on balance rate him like as a slight negative at a position where it's damaging to be a negative defender. So if you take those two things together, like a player who can be tough to fit offensively for a couple of reasons and a player who's not giving you necessarily a ton of defensive value, then that's where you start to think about, okay, he's putting up numbers, but how much is this actually helping us win?
This is the most interesting aspect because again, I've watched a lot of Ingram, and because I really liked that Pelicans team. Zion, I think people probably automatically assume that Ingram is more malleable because he played with Zion, but Zion kind of was the malleable one. Zion kind of fits wherever. Zion doesn't like ask for that much, and Zion cuts and Zion drives and Zion passes and he does all that kind of stuff. And Ingram didn't really have to change too much from himself. In fact, if you go not only just watching Ingram and not watching him and watching him not cut ever, but if you even try and sort for cuts like on Synergy, like where did Brandon Ingram cut? A lot of it is just like mislabeled. It's not even a cut. This is what I looked at pre-trade when it was starting to bubble up, both in like what's reported, out publicly and what's going on behind the scenes is like, man, there might be some motion here. Looking at his cut frequency, it's like 0.
Yeah.
But the really interesting thing here is that the Raptors are the team, this is what I talked about with Joe Cacharo, the shot location team. They get to the right spots. They move the ball. They play this way. The culture is infectious to some degree. If there is going to be a marriage or a place where it happens, Toronto is going to be the place where they motivate Brandon Ingram to cut, to move without the ball. And then what Joe and I talked about is the Raptors are a team that takes all the right shots and makes none of them. And Brandon Ingram is a guy who makes so many of the wrong shots. Yeah. And when he takes these shots, boy, does he make them. He is a guy who, when he gets to the rim, he's responsible unassisted for so many of his own rim looks. But he cuts he never cuts. He never plays off ball. He never screens. So his rim frequency overall is really low. What happened to Pascal? He like 7x'd his off-ball screens from being the number one isolation, like not scorer, but frequency guy in the NBA under Nick Nurse to 7x'ing his off-ball screens under Darko Rajovic. And now Pascal is playing like fundamentally much different basketball by the end of the time he was in Toronto to where he is in, Indiana right now. I think, and I hope this is, hope, maybe cope is what happens. But if anybody is going to motivate Ingram to move, and if there's any player who has the skill set and the body to reward movement, it will be Brandon Ingram. It's a hopeful marriage, but we got to see if it shakes out. But the bones are there for this to work. But it's year 9. Like, you can believe it with Ingram. Some people don't, and I understand why. Like, for example, I got a lot of pushback when Dennis Schroeder won the FIBA MVP, and I wrote this article being like, this is great for Dennis. This means nothing for the Raptors. This doesn't change anything about who he is. And that was completely correct. And somebody can be like, Brandon Ingram is not going to move. That touch time is going to stay high. He's going to change the offense. I mean, Emmanuel Quickley has thrown this offense out of loops because he sticks on ball too much. Yeah. If Quickley's able to do it, and that's Quickley, certainly Ingram can come in and hijack this thing. But I'm hoping, play style wise, that happens. And also defense. I've said before, I think you probably are in the same boat. Love huge teams. Let's dig into this a little bit. I'll let you try and lead yourself down the path if you so choose. You don't have to. What does Ingram at the 3 and a huge team do for you? Is there any potential there?
There's potential there, but I'll just say off the jump that I think I'm at a point now in the way that I think about the game where I'm more interested in functional size than measurable size.
Sure.
So Ingram obviously has a lot of great measurable size, like 6'8", probably like over 7 foot wingspan, I would imagine.
7'3".
7'3" wingspan. And yet I don't think that he really leverages that at the defensive end of the floor. I think he leverages it offensively with the high release that I mentioned, and like you mentioned, like his ability to finish at the rim. Defensively, it's like, you know, I think about like the Thunder last year. They were a super small team. And then in the offseason, they traded Josh Giddey for Alex Caruso. And this was before they'd signed Hartenstein, right? And on paper, it's like, wow, you were a small team and you traded a guy who was 6'8" for a guy who was 6'4". But my thinking about it was like Alex Caruso has way more functional size than Josh Giddey does at the defensive end of the floor. Like, can credibly guard more positions, is just going to be more physical and forceful, box out better, like all these different things where the 6'8" versus 6'4" doesn't matter to me as much. And that's kind of my thing with Ingram is like, obviously anyone can see he's very svelte, you know, he's a lithe guy. And that, you know, if you're going up against like the power wings of the world, then, you know, having that kind of build can be disadvantaging. It's really about like with the moments or the stretches where I feel like I've recognized his defense actually kind of popping off the screen is just when he's engaged in doing stuff as a low man. That's when his length can really come into play and be a factor. I haven't seen a ton of that stuff where it's like as a nail defender, you know, where he's using that wingspan to prevent drivers from entering the paint. I haven't seen a ton of that from him, but as a guy who can come over as that low man defender and like be a deterrent at the rim, that's where I think he can make an impact. But he's just not a super physical defender. So yes, being a big team with like him and Scotty at the 3 and the 4, having that secondary rim protection in theory allows you to do a lot of different things defensively. Like you have those guys out there with the center. You want to play that center higher up in the pick and roll. You want to switch a little bit. It gives you a little bit more insulation on the backside.
As far as in rotation, there's something that I find correlates quite often is that because guys are usually just picking up their dribble, they're on their first step around the dig. You have to be really physical to affect change. You can't be effete. That's not going to help anything. However, if you're a skinnier guy and you're at the back end, guys are on their last step, so they're not able to use the body. Some guys are able to, usually especially functional athletes are able to. Mm-hmm. But a guy like Ingram can be more effective as the low man because guys are on their last step. So it's not as much a physicality game as it is like closing off windows game with length. And Ingram definitely fits that. There's a reason why Fred VanVleet was like as good a nail defender as Jason Tatum. They're both these, and Tatum is a great nail defender, especially when he's engaged. But Ingram, I think, I don't expect him to be this big nail guy, because the best players, even if there's help at the nail, they test it. And Ingram might be a guy who, like, let's say Scotty's on the other end. Scotty might see Ingram in the slot and be like, not pushing through. But a guy like RJ probably is going to drive right through Ingram's dig, and it might not matter at all. It probably won't affect him. But if the Raptors can keep Ingram away from stuff and kind of just like this eat space kind of guy, especially if he is engaged, I think there's room for him to be an above average defender in this scheme. And I also really like the way that size multiplies. This has happened to Tobias Harris, who has gotten better defensively in my mind over the past couple of years. But when he wasn't as engaged, he still got a lot of pluses because he was next to these big teams where it was just like, there's this big bastard and this big bastard, and this guy's big. He's not a bastard, but he's still big, I think that if the Raptors are playing Jakob, Scotty, and Ingram, there really is opportunity to just be big in a lot of places. And RJ isn't a massive 2, but he is a big 2. And Grady plugging in at 2 would be, pretty good size. And Emmanuel at the 1 is, pretty good size. And Emmanuel's another functional aggressiveness thing, right? Because Davion could cover a lot more space functionally than I guess Quickly was able to. But there's room. But if Ingram just doesn't bring it on that end, it can just be kind of like passive, below average defender, which actually would be a plus on some guys on the roster. But for a guy, if he gets like that $48 million a year, it's probably not exactly what you're expecting. I guess we'll see, man. And especially if the Raptors are like, it's interesting because the Cavs are running into this. It's why they traded for DeAndre Hunter, is like, and God, we'll get into this right away because this is your cross matching thing. We'll leave the Ingram stuff on the whatever you table something. There's tons of different words for it. But when you're an okay team, you don't worry about this stuff that much. You just try and get good. The Cavs are now realizing that the way they built their team, they're like, damn, if there's a team with 2 big wings, they're bashing the hell out of us repeatedly. Let's get DeAndre Hunter and try and shore this up. Even though Karis LeVert is rocking hard this year, we have to shore this up. The Raptors may very well come to this point where, this doesn't fit exactly well. We have to pivot. But for right now, I like being able to believe on the size, being able to kind of like Red Rover. Is that a decent pitch to you?
If they get to be as good as the Cavs are right now and realize, no, we need to change some things, then I think we'll be okay.
I'm ecstatic if that's the case, man.
So yeah, I totally get that. And as far as size being a multiplier, I think you can look at some of those Pelicans teams and see that that's how they got by. I mean, in a couple of those seasons, they somehow just got by with opponents bricking away from 3, like multiple seasons in a row, them having the lowest opponent 3-point percentage somehow. But a lot of it was just, you can look at their starting lineups where it's like JV, Zion, Ingram, and it's like 3 neutral to negative defenders in the starting lineup, and the team's like 6th or 7th in defensive efficiency. A lot of that maybe you could point to Herb Jones and the work that he does sort of taping that defense together, but a lot of it is also just, if you're huge everywhere, that makes up for a lot.
Shrink the floor. Yeah, that's the I guess the quick way of saying it. Any other reservations that we can discuss a little bit? But then I do want to talk about play style changes across the NBA.
Yeah, just to close out the Ingram conversation, I'll say, I hear people talking about the value of his spacing. And that's maybe the thing that I bump against the most because, good 3-point shooter. I think 37% as a Pelican, which is what matters because that's when he got there, started working with Fred Vinson, changed his shot. 37% from 3. Pretty good. I don't think that his spacing doesn't really match that. Because he doesn't really shoot it on high volume from 3-point range. And B, and we can this will dovetail, I think, with our conversation about modern offense generally, but spacing to me is just so much more than what a guy shoots from 3-point range. It is about the volume. It's about the quickness of the release. It's about how you move away from the ball, how you're forming up off of drives, your willingness to cut and relocate into open space. And it's like, how quick is your trigger? You know, how willing are you to pull off of the catch? And Ingram, to me, is one of these guys who doesn't do that often. You know, like, he has a tendency to catch and hold and probe and, frankly, kill advantages sometimes. And so that's where we get into, okay, does Darko's system move him away from that into a more streamlined kind of role where he's making quicker decisions? Or does he become the kind of squeaky wheel in that system where this offense that relies so much on extending advantages is now having them grind to a halt? So that's the thing about his spacing, is I don't think the 3-point percentage alone really tells the story on that front.
It never does. Like, the Raptors, when they started out last season, they had horrible spacing, terrible. But they had a stretch for the first like 20 games. Or 15 games. They were like 4th or 5th in the NBA in 3-point percentage. The Pelicans last year were 4th in 3-point percentage. Mm-hmm. Was their spacing good? No. And also, it's kind of like the Miles Turner didn't actually fix Pascal Siakam's spacing. The way that the Pacers structure their sets, the way they slide Andrew Nembhard into the dunker, the way that they are quick and intentional about moving the ball, that's what opens up slots for Pascal Siakam in that. Like, and it's also about how the guy on ball uses spacing. Like, RJ Barrett faces an extra defender in the lane on a higher percentage of drives than Scotty Barnes does. RJ still drives it. He tests the dig. Scotty, less so. And it's about the pace at which you drive. And Ingram, he will, and if you want to make it simple and simplify it, Ingram is a guy who he's going to make the defender take one more step out. However, a guy who doesn't move, this is the 5-slot offense, right? Is like a guy who doesn't move. It just means that defender's one step out. The defender can acclimate to that and still gum up possessions. But if there's a guy who moves intelligently, it's, even if he's not as good a shooter, maybe it's one less step, but it's 3 steps this way, then it's 2 steps this way, and defenders will drift. Defenders will lose their spacing. That's why you move the ball, to move the defense. The defense doesn't move because they want to. The defense moves because they have to. Yes, because a guy can shoot the ball, but hopefully because a guy threatens. And Ingram doesn't threaten. And this is what I wrote about today. It's if anybody wants to read it at raptorsrepublic.com, it's called Emmanuel Quickly Needs to Let It Fly. And it's kind of comparing. I asked Fred this on Media Day 2 years ago. You know, it seems like the Raptors are gearing up for a wing-led offense. How do you feel about being a guy who will get much more catch and shoot opportunities? And then Fred said, well, I'm a basketball player and all the right things. And then he was moaning about it the whole season. I don't like this. This sucks ass. I should have the ball more. And then they traded for Jakob, and the offense changed to a pick and roll offense featuring those two.
Yeah.
I think the Raptors are headed once again for a wing-led offense. Will Emmanuel Quickly be the guy who makes the change quicker than Ingram? I think that can smooth out a lot of stuff, because there is a math game to some degree of like, hey, you have to take some threes. The Raptors, you don't have to take it all. They certainly don't. They haven't changed it completely, but they need threes from somewhere. And who better than Emmanuel Quickly, who can't get everything on ball because he can't rise up in a phone booth like Donovan Mitchell at his size, because he has a low gather and he has a low release. He has a slower jump shot. Most of his on-ball stuff comes off of a step back, not a pull. Why? Because he has to create a lot of space. If you turn him more into a catch and shoot shooter who can work off of somebody like Brandon Ingram, somebody like Scotty Barnes, then we're looking at a guy who's cooking with gas. I actually want to bring Blake in here quick, because he can explain the aspect of the contract thing very thoroughly. Blake, you're live with myself and Joe. How's it going?
Good. I heard your voice starting to go again, so I was like, okay, he needs help. He needs a tag. Yeah, it's been great stuff. I always love listening to Joe.
Exactly.
Thanks, Blake.
What's the high view? Actually, let's stick with this. And then we're going to talk about, I guess, cross matches in the NBA, which I'm very excited to hear Joe's thoughts on because you wrote that fantastic piece on it. But Brandon Ingram, how he affects the rest of the players on the roster. Do you have a high, I guess, high-low view of that?
Cap-wise or like on-court wise?
Give us both.
Okay. I mean, on-court, I think it's fun, but some stuff to figure out. Like I like obviously the size, the shot making. We'll see. Like digging in on his Pelicans tape the last couple days. His like 5-6 assists a game come in a different way stylistically, I think, than the way the Raptors do it. He runs a lot of pick and roll for a big wing, which the Raptors could actually probably use a little bit more of, given how poor a pick and roll team they are. But yeah, I'm interested to see how that all fits. And then defensively, the big question is going to be like, there's no reason he is not a better defender than he is. So can you coax that out of him? And if he can, then that makes some of the pieces in that starting lineup fit a little better. I guess RJ is the one guy who offensive role wise, and even spot, I saw comments in the chat earlier about, does he move to the bench at some point? There's obviously a cap implication of, is he the odd man out if things get tight? So that'll be the most interesting to figure out there.
Quick thing, just quickly. Last season, Ingram created 181 3-point looks for the Pelicans out of 718 pick and roll possessions. Those are for other Pelicans. He shot 30% on his own pull-up threes out of the pick and roll last season, but a pretty healthy amount of threes created. And the Raptors don't necessarily get that much of this year. Just numbers to put context to that.
Yeah, and he was like 72nd percentile scorer as a pick and roll handler or something like that too?
I think Synergy had him 80th with passes last season. Roughly the same grouping as Scotty was last year. Okay.
Yeah, that's really good then. And, I've thought Scotty could be, I mean, there's not really a point in using Scotty as a screener if like Davion's the handler or something like that. But, Scotty as a screener is something that this offense hasn't probably got as much out of yet as they could. So that'd be interesting to see if they can build, especially, I know your piece today was kind of about how that could impact quickly in his 3-point volume. I haven't read it yet because I don't read your work, exactly. Yeah, it's, that makes sense. It could have an impact there. Cap wise, I put this in the chat a little earlier, but the big number to keep in mind kind of is 49 million. So that's like when I did my cap breakdown, I'd already assumed that Jamison Battle was getting that deal. And you're looking at 49 million below the tax, and that has to accomplish Ingram's next deal, whatever your first round pick gets. So if it's the number 1 pick, it's a lot more expensive than the number 5 pick. Champagne problems at that point, right? Like if you got Cooper Flag, and then you'd have 3 roster spots to fill out. So you got about $50 million to do Ingram, your pick, and fill out the roster, which is doable, especially if you do an Ingram deal where it's like escalating 8%, every year instead of being flat like Quickly's and Pirtle's deals were. But it gets tight. The other solution is like you could just pay the tax and all this gets way, way easier, which just do that.
Yeah. Do you have any expectations of where Ingram might end up?
Not really. Like I would love, like 35 would be awesome. I would be happy about the trade if he signs on at 35. If it's 40, then I'm hoping it's done as an extension because he can only get 3 extra years as an extension right now. Whereas if you take it into the summer, he could get 5. A lot more comfortable with 40 on a 3-year than on a 5-year. And then, yeah, as it gets north of 40, that's where it gets really uncomfortable in terms of, okay, do you have to factor in as part of the trade accounting that you now at some point maybe have to move RJ or Emmanuel quickly, and what does the return look like for them? It gets like trickle down effect pretty quickly as you get into like 42, 43 a year. I know you threw out a little earlier on this that like, hey, you wouldn't be all that surprised if it nudges toward 50 per, like 144 is what he's eligible for on an extension. It gets dicier there. And this is honestly, you look around the league over the last decade or so, this is the hardest type of player to evaluate from a contract perspective. Like we know max guys deserve the max and should probably get more than the max. We know how to value a minimum guy, a mid-level guy, but guys who are really, really good and not stars, like guys in that maybe like 21st to 50th best player in the league range, it's the hardest guy to figure out a contract for, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Pascal this year, he's what, 11th in EPM. His usage has gone down, but he's been hyper efficient. He elevates the Pacers defense in a crazy way. But I mean, year 3, it might look a little crazy to be paying him like what, 48, 50 or something around there. It's tough.
It's one like the Pascal thing too is like if the Pacers make a finals run this year or next, they're probably fine with whatever the back end of that contract looks like. Similar to like, oh, the Middleton deal was bad at the back end. You know, the Sixers thought the same thing when they overpaid Tobias Harris long term. Like, if you do what you're supposed to do in the early part of the deal, who cares about the other stuff? Like, nobody would be complaining about George Springer's contract if the Jays had won a World Series the last 2-3 years, right? Like, this is it's how you kind of price it in.
Okay. What I want to pivot to now is really the crux of why Joe is here, because I always learn, for anybody listening, Joe is one of the preeminent NBA writers in covering the league, and always takes time to dive in on these cool stylistic play style changes. And Joe, if you'd like to provide for listeners in a way that only you can, the pitch on cross matching in the NBA, and we'll get into what's happening and kind of how the Raptors might be a team that benefits or hurts.
Yeah, basically it's just a defensive tactic that is happening more and more around the league, where teams don't necessarily want to put their centers on opposing centers, especially if the opposing center can shoot the ball. But even if they can't, it can be a way to just keep them out of pick and roll action. So they're not getting dragged up having to defend, 100 ball screens a game. They're stashed on a lower usage wing, or sometimes even a guard, ideally one that doesn't shoot the ball all that well. And that's allowing them to just roam around and help and muck stuff up elsewhere on the floor. And then meanwhile, you'll have a big wing guarding the opposing center, and you don't worry too much about that size mismatch, because post-up scoring is something that's really difficult to do with the way that modern defense and defensive rules work. And frankly, there just aren't that many good like post-up scoring centers left in the league at this stage. So you can get away with that. And then it's like, if a team is running a 1-5 pick and roll, you feel a lot better about switching that with the wing that's guarding the center, both because you probably feel better about the wing hanging on that switch against a guard, but also because even if that wing gets burned on that switch, well, there's your 7-foot center on the back line roving off of this low usage wing, ready to provide cover at the rim. So that's kind of the crux of the tactic and why teams are doing it and how it works, why it works. And in writing the piece, I mean, kind of what was interesting to me, part of it was wanting to talk to some of the centers who are guarding wings and how that's affecting them. But what's interesting to me about the tactic is how it's changing offensive behavior and what that means for the players who are getting guarded by centers, how it changes how they have to operate. And so, like, this is the way that these stylistic cycles move in the NBA. Like, a trend will emerge, teams will jump on it, and then there has to be a counter reaction where teams figure out how they want to deal with it. And so for these guards, what that means is like they have to figure out how to move when they don't have the ball in their hands. They have to figure out how to be screeners so that they can still pull those centers into the action. And I just think it's like a really interesting thing that is changing gameplay around the league. So I wanted to talk to some of the guys who have been involved in it on the offensive end and the defensive end. And I found some of their answers pretty illuminating.
There's a lot of great quotes. I put there's the link to it in chat right now for anybody listening. Just go bookmark that. You don't have to stop listening to the podcast. I mean, hell, it's the piece is really good. You can if you want, but and for any audio listeners, it'll be linked in the description or whatever it is. But you mentioned the difference between Giddey and Caruso functionally earlier defensively. You have great, cascading quotes from them in how they function as guys who get guarded by centers. When you look at this Raptors team, they are a team that, but just it makes sense with Jakob there and with a guy like RJ, perhaps. RJ has seen a lot of funky, I guess, coverages this year so far. What do you make of the Raptors as a team to hunt this in one way defensively and beat it in another offensively?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Like, on the one hand, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think the Raptors have actually seen that many cross-matching defenses this year, in part because mostly like teams are going to be okay putting their centers on Jakob. Like, he's not going to stretch
They
them
only
out.
care when the team is good.
Yeah, yes. And
You have that in the
Mark
piece.
Dagnall said that. He's like, we weren't seeing any of these coverages when we were winning 20-something games a year. And now that we're good, like, we have to figure it all out. So that's part of it. And yeah, like, I mean, if teams wanted to, I don't necessarily think Ochai would be the guy who would get that cross match, but I do think it's notable that, especially when Yak has been out of the lineup, he's been one of their highest volume ball screeners. And doing it in a way, and this is another thing with these, especially when it's a guard who's not especially adept at shooting the ball. Usually when you see a guard screening in an inverted pick and roll, it's like his shooting gravity is a big part of the equation. And he's screening or ghosting and like jetting out to the 3-point line. But if it's one of these like lesser shooting guards who has a center on them and they're screening, they're roll men. And they're either like rolling and scoring at the basket, or they're getting into a 4-on-3 situation, in which case they can kind of use their guard skills to play make out of those actions. So I think Ochai has actually been like quite good as a ball screener and roll man.
Yes.
Like, there was a time when like the Kelly Olynyk handling and Ochai screening and rolling was like one of their most used pick and roll combos. So I think that's interesting. I can't say I've seen a ton from RJ as a ball screener this year. So like, if he was the guy who was getting that cross match, I think it would look more like you maybe give him more of the ball and have him just try to attack that center in space and use his burst in the half court. Like, if they're sagging off of him, and he shot the ball pretty well this year too, so he could just shoot it. But also, like, if he wanted to just eat up that space and attack the big at the rim, then I think that could be a way that it could be effective as well. But
I think the Ochai thing is really interesting because he is smaller than most wings, but he's definitely plays like a wing. And they use him both as a cutter when they short the pick and roll and as a screener outright to create those angles, because the Raptors have big ball handlers, so their high-low stuff is easier to access. And Ochai is a guy who is very comfortable for a guard-sized player to create a seal, catch over the top, and go finish at the rim. It was not working last year. He missed everything. He was 1 of 22 from the short mid-range, but it started when, myself, Blake, and Will were watching at the Montreal practice. It was like, Ochai's making everything. We have 3 guys here who watch a lot of Raptors games. Blake, what have you made of Ochai as a screener, and have you noticed anyone else kind of like finding things?
Yeah, it's been really fun to see him as a screen. Like, it's been the last couple of years, it's been, I think I even asked you and Lewis this for one of your mailbag ones early in the season, maybe 10, 12 games in. It's like, are you seeing any progress in the quality of screens on this team? Because Yak's a really good screener, and then everyone else isn't. Like Grady has shown flashes. He's starting to figure out the screener stuff and like, get the forearms up and like tackling sled it kind of. But for the most part, this is a team that really doesn't have a lot of screeners. Ochai is not going to like hammer someone, I don't think, but he has pretty good footwork when he slips out of them. And then like, because he's long, and I think it's a similar skill set. If you're an undersized screener, the roll footwork and timing and how you present yourself is similar to like, if you're making a baseline cut or whatever, just like how to be available for a pass and finish quickly. So I like that part of it. I think it's really important for Ochai's future and where you see the fit and stuff like that, for him to find these not unconventional, but like atypical ways for a wing to fit into the offense, because obviously he's one of the best wing defenders that they have. And if you were looking at that side of the ball, he makes a lot of sense as a starter, but where does he fit in as an offensive piece with that group? Well, the shooting is obviously one component of it. He won the 3-point contest, by the way, at Fan Day the other week. Like, he beat Grady in the 3-point contest.
That's not much of a surprise, I'll be honest.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It should. I would think with no defender and getting to be stationary, Grady would light it up. And Jameson, I'm surprised. I don't know if Jameson was there actually. He might have been with 905. But anyway, so I think it's important for Ochai to like find spots as a cutter, do some atypical stuff as a screener, because they're not going to like. It's kind of the thing OG ran into, and OG obviously much further along as a player when he was here. But, you know, when he would talk about, or they would talk about, how do you get more touches for, you know, OG Anunoby, it's not going to come from like, hey man, here's a couple pick and rolls. Hey man, we're going to run this play for you. Ochai's got to kind of get in where he fits in. And so I think having that versatility of skill set and things you can do. Sorry, Brody's attacking the webcam here. Yeah, I think that's really important for like figuring out how he fits with this group, you know, medium term.
So even outside of that, there's a whole other aspect of the Raptors have a guy like Jakob who you want to keep in closer proximity to the rim. And they had a huge run of great form defensively because Davion allowed Jakob to sit lower. And that's just like a massive thing to be able to do. They were number one in defense over a 10-game stretch. Joe, is Jakob one of those funky matchup guys going into the future? Do you see that? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so it's funny that you ask, because I think so. Because I think he's generally pretty mobile, but I think ideally you would want to use that mobility on the back line rather than in some of like the higher up, more aggressive pick and roll coverages. But so I asked Darko about this after it wasn't the most recent Knicks game. It was the one before that when they played in Toronto. And I was interested to see, because like I talked to Josh Hart about this before the game. He didn't really give me anything, so I didn't even bother putting in the piece.
What just wait? Sorry to cut you off. Why did balloons just fly by you on your thing?
I thought that was. I just assumed that was Blake's doing, but
no.
I've never had that happen before.
Permissions in StreamYard.
Whoa!
I don't know. So I mentioned Josh Hart. Is that a trigger for balloons to come up?
Oh, maybe the word heart. It could be interesting.
Anyway, so yeah, this is something the Knicks have faced all year, because teams would prefer not to put their centers on Cat. And Josh Hart is there as this kind of ready-made cross-matching target, because he's not an especially good or high-volume three-point shooter. So in that game, the Raptors like barely cross-matched at all, which is something, again, like I've seen so many defenses do to the Knicks, and I was kind of expecting to see it at least a little bit, and they barely did. And especially down the stretch of that game, they kind of got killed by the Brunson-Cat two-man game with Yak guarding Cat. So the next day at Raptors practice, I asked Darko about it and kind of why he didn't feel comfortable doing it. He was like, yeah, I thought about it. We did it a couple times out of timeouts, but like right now I'm just focused on getting our base defense in order. And I just clocked it because it wasn't the first time that Darko has like said something like that to me in like a question about defensive tactics. And on the one hand, I get it. Like, you're trying to build habits. You're with this rebuilding team. You want to establish your base. But he was like, I don't want to confuse our guys. Like, and I'm just like, okay, yes, this is a younger team, but this is not just like a team full of 20-year-olds. Like Jakob Poeltl's been in the league for 8-9 years. Like Scotty's in his 4th year. Like RJ's in his 6th year. Like, there are some vets on this team. A couple of these guys have played in Nick Nurse defenses before. I don't think it's putting too much on them to do something that a lot of other teams in the league are doing and that makes good intuitive sense. So that just stuck out to me as kind of like, and I like Darko a lot, and I think he's done a really good job. But that just struck me as I'm like, you don't need to necessarily be treating this team with these kinds of kid gloves, where it's like, if you're trying to win a game, that just sort of makes sense, I think, as a way to guard the Knicks. So that he said that was why he was reluctant to do it. But I think if you look at the team, the makeup of the team, a lot of centers in the league, I think you're like, Scotty is going to be capable of guarding. Like, I think Scotty could have taken on the Cat matchup, and you could have put Yak on Josh Hart, and I think that would have been an effective tactic. You don't necessarily have to do that every possession of the game, but it's an effective curveball to throw for a couple minutes at a time.
Okay, yeah. Also, Joe, like, what is your Samson? Like, what is your feeling on that? Like, you kind of just explained it, but I would also I would understand what Darko is saying more. And they had been good for a couple weeks there, but like, if they were doing well, doing the really conservative base defense, but at the point in time that I think you had that conversation with him, like, they weren't even doing the base stuff well. It's like, okay, if you were like 15th in the league in defense, you were like, we don't want to mess with a good thing. We want to lock this down, nail this down. that would be more of an argument for it, right? But like, if you're bad anyway, why wouldn't you, try to do the not low hanging fruit, because it's like medium hanging fruit, but some of the matchup stuff.
Yeah, and especially because I think part of the reason that they had been struggling defensively during that stretch, which Samson alluded to, was that they felt like they had to play Yak higher up on the floor, because like the point of attack defense just wasn't up to snuff. So if you're looking for ways to have him lean into his strengths, keep him closer to the basket, then that would have been, I think, a natural way to try to do it. But generally speaking, I think the team is like well set up to do that kind of thing.
It's been really interesting to track. This Raptors team is a great like inflection point for the theory of coaching defense, because what they're asking the team to do could only be enacted by a couple players on the roster, but also harkens back to the guard your yard Pacers, who were the team who provided the least amount of help in the NBA for a time. But now that their defense is starting to get better, it's because they've introduced more concepts that help. They move more. They ask guys to account for 2 or 3 different things at a time rather than just a base defense. And you look at like Canada in chat says, could it just be part of the tank? I mean, some teams, they might want to introduce these aggressive aspects of the defense, these hard to achieve aspects of the defense first, because it's like that. I'd rather have to turn a guy down than have to turn him up, man. Like you want to get that out of your players. Like when they say, when Darko says, I want Grady guarding every player in the league, you're like, damn, that seems insane to me, but go ahead. And then that's what I've been asking every time I'm at the arena, that when the coach is like, hey, how do the players impact how you coach defense? What does it look like? And so much of the coaches, maybe they're just kind of giving lip service to their players in media, but also they're saying the players are so responsible for policing their own behavior and instilling these ethics themselves. Blake, Joe, you guys have been covering the NBA longer than I have. Does anyone have any thoughts on how all of this intersects with the Raptors?
Go ahead, Joe. This is your piece. The thing you're asking, Taylor Jenkins about every day and stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have been like asking this question to a lot of different coaches, just about how do you enact evolution stylistically? Like, how does it come about? Is it like a seed of an idea in your head that you're trying to get to, and you're like forcing that on a roster that maybe isn't entirely equipped to execute it, but you believe in this thing and you're going to like shape your team to like fit the mold of the idea that you have of how NBA basketball should be played in the year 2025? Or are you looking at your roster and saying, here are some interesting things that we can do that make sense with this group? And the vast majority of them have said the latter. Like that's where it comes from, is like, it just comes from the players. We look at the group that we have. Mark Daigneault especially like harped on this. It was like, this is what like the group that we have is capable of. Like we had to obviously do some brainstorming, some ideating on the whiteboard to figure out how to get the most out of them at both ends of the floor. But it's the players and their skill sets that are dictating what we do. So I think in the vast majority of cases, that is the big driver. But of course, like as a coach, you have to have the vision, like to recognize what you are able to do with this group of players. And so the Pacers example is one that's always been interesting to me. Like you've mentioned a couple times what Rick Carlisle said to you when you asked him about the future of defense. And it's like, yeah, guard your yard, not over helping. I do think there's like a lot of over helping in defense around the league. But that Pacers team, like if you look at the Celtics, that's what they do, right? Like they also help, last year they probably helped less than any team other than the Pacers until the Pacers kind of tweaked their scheme. And it works for Boston because they have all over the roster guys who can guard their yards really effectively. Yeah. The Pacers were not equipped to do that. And so it was effective in the sense that they weren't giving up a lot of threes because of how little they were helping, but they were getting annihilated at the rim. And on the whole, they were like, a bottom 5, bottom 6 defense for most of the season. So I think it has to be kind of a marriage of the two. Like you have to have ideas, but you also have to be adaptable and recognize which ideas are and aren't going to work with who you have.
I think the Nick Nurse era Raptors, and we're going back a little bit, are a good example of kind of the friction between those things as well, right? Where like championship Raptors, obviously they built that around like, we got Kawhi and then we went out and got Marc Gasol. All we're going to do is try to drive ball handlers to the spaces on the floor with the most length and size. Like, let's put them in little tiny boxes. And then with Steph, obviously they did something different, but like Giannis, it was just like, let's put him in let's create corners that we can trap them in all around the floor because we have the personnel to do that and we have so much size. But then the post-championship Raptors were this interesting, like Nick Nurse philosophically very clearly believed in forcing turnovers as like a key part of your defense. And I think that was born of one, a lack of confidence somewhat in what the half court offense would look like. So you want to juice the transition offense. But two, I think, and I never asked him this, but like, knowing Nick Nurse and seeing where the league's gone and seeing what the Thunder do and things like that, I wonder if it was trying to get ahead, because Nick Nurse has talked about for years, like the defensive challenge as a coach is to, respond to what teams are doing in the pick and roll or going away from the pick and roll, even if you're a Memphis style offense. One is adapting to that, but two is trying to figure out what's happening next and be ready to adapt to that. And I wonder how much of we got to force turnovers, we got to win the shooting possession battle that way wasn't just because the offensive talent was somewhat limited, but also like, hey, we're getting to a point where every offense is so good and teams are shooting enough threes that you're always going to be at least a little bit risk of variance, that winning the possession battle is the most controllable way. Then you have to ride out that variance and swing the fact that offenses aren't homogenized, like offensive talent isn't even, but I think like the spread of offensive talent has shrunk a little bit. So maybe acknowledging the possession battle was going to be your way to win that. Now, by the end, the Raptors' entire defense was just too overloaded on all we do is gamble and force turnovers. Gary Trent is going to be unleashed as the biggest gambler since Dostoevsky. Like this is all, that's all it is. And then suddenly you had this team that had like OG, who's a really good defender, Fred, who is a good defender, Pascal, who at that point in time was still a good defender, Yak, who's a good defender. And you had none of these guys like actually just playing straight up defense. So I think that highlights both what coaches are trying to do and then the limitations of like, you can't be dogmatic about that principle. And yes, my webcam is bad today. I don't know why it's not even dark in my apartment. I know it looks dark in here too. I don't know what's going on.
We have balloons popping up on Joe's. We have, yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Sorry. Yeah. I'm hoping those balloons will reappear at some point. Maybe something I say right now will bring them back. But it's interesting that you mentioned those Nick Nurse Raptors, because in thinking about and talking about how evolution happens, like on the last episode that we did of Pound the Rock, we had a bunch of guests on, and like the question that I was asking all of them was, where is the NBA trending? And those Raptors teams came up a lot, in part because Will was on the show, but even apart from that, I think so much of what those teams did, so many of those trends that they were on the cutting edge of, have just caught on like wildfire around the league. And it hammered home something that I have long believed. And I've heard, I think Mike Prada is somebody who's talked about this as well. The teams that kind of like come up with these tactics where ingenuity comes from so much of the time, like these aren't necessarily the teams that win. Because often they come from these teams that have these like big fundamental problems that they have to try to work around. And they have to get really creative in trying to find solutions to them. And it's like really just the idea that necessity is the mother of invention. And those teams, even with those creative solutions, often aren't good enough to win. But what they can do is sort of crystallize an idea that teams with more talent can then capitalize on. So you're seeing so many teams around the league now try to game the possession battle, crash the offensive glass, like send a ton of strong side help on defense if you're talking about the Thunder and the way that they operate. Like all of these things that those Nick Nurse Raptors teams did in just an effort to like win 48 games are now things that some of the best teams in the league are really focused on doing.
The brainchild of, hey, imagine if Pascal was actually Shea and Precious was Chet Holmgren. Like, is that good? Also the Celtics and like the Ime Udoka, like, hey, this is how we're going to cross match the center. It's like, well, this is no longer 37-year-old Al Horford. This is the biggest Latvian man on earth, like all that kind of stuff is interesting. I will say what we're going to talk about before we get out of here is the objective wins that the Raptors have had as a front office, because I think that's an interesting thing to dive in on right before the All-Star break. And I will say that, hey, I've looked at the demographics of the YouTube channel. Not a lot of kids in here. You've left middle school, and so have we. Axe draws on 40 years of body spray research and the expertise of the world's leading perfumers to craft quality fragrances and bring continual innovation, just like the Raptors have been, aimed to help young guys feel confident in their own skin. You can find Axe, the Toronto Raptors 30th anniversary collaboration, at Loblaws, Walmart, Shoppers Drug Mart, and Real Canadian Superstore, all the major retailers. Blake, Joe, let me ask you a question. A lot of people are saying this is a big home run, this Brandon Ingram trade for these Raptors. I seem to think it's an objective win to me. I think it can get into home run territory. I'm more in that range. Ochai Agbaji got traded for a first overall pick, a late one. That could be in the win range once if he actually fits into a playoff rotation. This kind of stuff all has to bear out. Over the past few years, we'll start with you, Blake. When you think about this team, this front office, what are some objective wins that come to mind? Like, they made this decision, this rocks.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me the last little bit is the player identification and development seems to be coming back around. Like, I know that's not directly related to the trade, but that was such a big component of how they built not just the championship team, but how they built meaningful depth to be able to make the consolidation trades for that championship team, to have a value in a guy like Yak, to develop DeLon Wright into a piece that was valuable, to be comfortable trading away a bunch of firsts and seconds on your way up and know that, hey, we've got depth, we've got young guys, we can develop these guys. And then they hit kind of a multi-year dry spell. But I do think, Ochai has already turned into more than I think what people thought he was at that point. He certainly maybe hasn't quite lived up to the defensive side just yet. Like, he's good, but it's kind of the bar is different with this roster composition.
I think his defense is vastly overrated right now.
Yeah, I don't know about vastly, but yeah, like relative to reputation and being the best wing defender on this roster is not that does not make you OG Anunoby or Lou Dort, but he's already done more and developed more offensively than like last year. He was basically just the can you hit a wide open spot up corner three? And the answer to that was sometimes, I guess. And now he's actually has some useful skills like we talked about earlier. But then you also look at a draft where it's okay, Jamal Shed, middle of the second round, Jonathan Mobo, top of the second round, Jacoby Walter, the speed, none of those guys are remotely finished products, right? But you got two guys in the second round who have already played rotation minutes. You got an undrafted guy who's already made a two-way deal and then been converted to an NBA deal, and then you have a mid-first round pick who at least seems to have the kind of developmental capacity. Like, he's improving kind of week by week. So those aren't trades or whatever, but it's probably the thing I've been most encouraged by the last, say, 18 months is getting back to and these are things that they don't make all the difference in the world on their own. But if you can turn a undrafted guy into the value of a second round pick, you can turn a second round pick into the value of a late first round pick. All these things add up and put you in a position to, when you're good again, have inexpensive depth on the roster, make consolidation trades for the next guy, etc. So I think it's an important part of what this front office did well before that's come back around.
It's I started with this pen and now I have a boat. The interesting thing too is there probably isn't a statistical case to be made for anybody that they selected in this year's draft, like Jacoby's splits are what, 40, 30, 70. He struggled a bunch to hit shots. I mean, Grady has saved his efficiency through being able to draw fouls and having these crazy drives to the rim. And shooting almost 90% from the free throw line, but he's not a statistical home run. Mobo certainly isn't. Jamal certainly isn't. Shamshay, we like what we see. Cody Wiles has a great video essay on him, but it's just like watching film and hoping things turn out. Joe, what have you made of this past draft? Is there in the film guys you like that you think, the stats don't quite belay just how good they might be?
I think it's Jacoby for me. I honestly think so much of where he struggled is just the 3-point shooting. And that's honestly come around lately. It's just like the first couple months of the season when that jumper was in like a deep freeze. And that has just like really pulled down his overall efficiency. But in terms of like his feel for the game, the way that he moves, like I don't think he entirely has a sense all the time of like how to move around and cut off ball, but like the willingness to do it and the acuity with which he does it some of the time is what's exciting to me. And I think like he grabs some rebounds too that get me out of my chair, where I'm like, I love a guard who can rebound that way. He just plays with so much activity, but also I think a lot of intelligence. So I'm pretty excited about Jacoby. And I mean, just to echo Blake's point generally, if you're asking like what has this front office done well consistently, it is identify talent in the draft. Like this front office drafts well. Even the dry spell that Blake was alluding to was like if I'm pulling up their draft history here, to me it's like between like 2018 they didn't have a pick at all.
It starts with DeJuan.
2019 was when they had the 59th pick and drafted DeJuan Hernandez. 2020 was Malachi Flynn. But like if you go through like all, that one's tough. But also it's like the 29th pick, which doesn't typically return a lot of value anyway. It just hurts because of who went directly after him and who went directly before him. Like sandwiched between Jaden McDaniels and Desmond Bane is tough. But like if you go through all of the first round picks that the Raptors have made since Masai Ujiri took over, I think that Malachi and Bruno are like the only bad picks in the bunch. And honestly, that is what has been like, it's not the only thing, but it's like compounded the frustration when they have been maybe too cavalier about tossing those picks away. Like the Thad trade, obviously the Yak trade, which like we don't need to relitigate.
If they didn't make the Thad trade, they could have got Nemhard, man.
And this is like we get this response from readers or listeners sometimes too, is like, oh, they don't need like it almost seems to devalue the picks because they do well with second rounders and undrafted and stuff. But my argument would be, if you do well with picks, I want more of them. Exactly. I don't want fewer of them. And like this is like the part of that was like the 2018 draft, 2019 draft, like that's the legacy cost for the championship, right? Like you were putting picks on the table first for Serge, then for Kawhi, a couple seconds in the Mark trade, and to unload the tax bill and things like that. Like that's a legacy cost you're fine with. But in general, I do feel like it kind of backwards undervalued picks, because it's like, don't worry, they'll get them in the second.
Right.
Well, I mean, when they had the fourth one, and it was a 3-player draft, and the Raptors thought it was a 3-player draft, they chose the best of the rest. And like Blake, I remember when Blake with the Athletic chose Scotty Barnes in their mock draft, everyone was like, "You dumbass, this guy's an idiot." But anyway, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was just going to say, so like to bring it back to the Ingram trade, which, like I said, I've like come around to being pretty positive on. But I've also seen people saying stuff to the extent of like, it's a nothing pick because like the Pacers are going to be good next year. And it's like, first of all, I think the Pacers are good and will continue to be good, but I don't think they're so good that you like write them in pen into like a top 10 record in the league. Like that could easily be a pick in the teens. And you just use the 19th pick in a draft that people have been dumping on nonstop for the last 2 years to draft a guy in Jacoby who I think is worth getting excited about. Now, like, is he ever going to be anywhere near as good as Brandon Ingram? Like, probably not. But, that to say that like the pick doesn't matter, especially like in the position the Raptors are in, I think there's at least a case to be made for like giving yourself as many bites at the apple as possible to get a guy who can give you like starter level production on a rookie scale deal. And so, just broadly speaking, and with the Yak trade too, it's like, obviously part of it was that they didn't think that they were going to lose Fred for nothing and then become a terrible team. But part of it too was like, they didn't believe in that draft class at all. And it's like, if you had that pick, like, you know, they could have Zach Edey right now. Like, I think that honestly, the long-term future of this team would feel a little bit different right now if they had Edey on his rookie deal instead of Yak on his deal. So there is a downside potential cost to this, and to act like it doesn't matter, I think, I don't know, just broadly speaking, front office that drafts well should give itself more chances to draft well, basically.
Can I ask a question? And this is to either of you, because Joe, you're a literary guy, and Samson, you're begrudgingly very, very smart. The term "more bites at the apple," I've heard it a bunch this week, and like it's one of those things. Like Dwayne Casey used to always say, "There's more than one way to skin a cat," and I'm like fascinated by how did this become a saying? Who was arguing about like, no, this is the only way to skin this cat? Like, what the hell are we doing? Like, I'm trying to picture a scenario in which like there's one apple and everyone's gets one bite of the apple and we pass it around the circle. But then the term comes that like, no, give me multiple bites at this apple. Where the hell did this term come from?
So I think it's a bobbing for apples thing. However, the skin the cat thing, I don't like hunting, but I come from a place where hunting is very popular, and there's something called field dressing, which is after you shoot a deer or some sort of wild game. All the guys walk out and you cut it up, you skin it, and I've sat there while there's like 6, 35 to 60-year-old men. You wouldn't believe how many different ways there is to do something right or wrong.
But
there's a lot of different.
The term should be like skin a venison then or something like that. Not why a cat.
Geez. I don't know. I don't know how that became a thing. It's like I say like dadgum, which is like dad gummit. I guess it's like an inverse of goddamn.
But I'm guessing it's not that this makes it any better, but I'm probably not talking about like a house cat, I'm thinking
sure.
They're probably thinking of more like a big game type.
A jungle cat?
Poor Brody is terrified.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know where that comes out of, but I was gonna say, Joe, I think what you're not understanding is that when the Raptors had the pick, it's actually a great pick, and the Pacers are on the edge of losing it. But now that they don't have the pick, it's a terrible pick. Like I feel like you're not getting this. It's very
right. Sorry, my mistake.
Yeah. And I think there are 3 guys here who are all very excited about Jacoby. Are there any other the Raptors? Well, this was something that Blake and I talked about for a long time. Was this there's a hubris in the Raptors fan base that is like, the guy we pick at 27 will be better than the guy you pick at number 4. Like, who gives a damn? Which actually was true for like the Pascal draft, but it isn't always exactly true. It is good to have high picks. It is good to have a lot of picks. However, I guess we didn't get Blake. Like, I didn't read your work on Brandon Ingram, or I didn't listen. Like, I was doing the show simultaneously. What was your knee-jerk reaction to that?
Yeah, I kind of put it in the chat earlier. Is like I love Brandon Ingram. Samson, you and I have talked about Brandon Ingram's game.
He's so
for
cool.
a long. Love watching him play. It's very smooth. The high release point. I think he's in the Levine category of like people talked about him being overrated for long enough that he actually became like a little underrated. Just like, yeah, are you at the right point in a rebuild to be surrendering a first round pick? And Ingram's only 27, so there is upside there. But like, if you pay him 45, if you have given up a first round pick and pay him $45 million on his next contract, you have cashed in a lot of, your paths to getting better. So it better work. But I really like the player. It's just, Are
you inclined to like it better because it runs in the face of like Blue Jays behavior? Like, they're like, oh, we actually traded this guy for 64 years of team control or whatever the hell happened.
Yeah, they are like really interestingly different front offices, and where like the Raptors 4 years in a row have done the pre-agency thing where it's like, but I guess the difference is like if Major League Baseball had a version of bird rights, maybe the Jays would operate differently. But yeah, the Jays being so horny for team control, at least when they were in the rebuild portion of what was it? Hey, we acquired 42 years of team control for guys who ended up playing like 42 games total. I don't know where that makes a difference, but it is interesting to contrast the kind of the styles.
Yeah, it's because that's the most boring aspect of this Brandon Ingram trade. But it's real analysis. It just sucks. It's boring. I hate it.
Yeah.
It's also like, for me, like that's like I really like watching Brandon Ingram play. I'm excited to do that. But like my role in the larger Raptors media ecosystem, and especially at Sportsnet, where we have Grange as a columnist and a reporter, and I'm on a show with Matt Bonner, who played in the NBA, is like where I provide value in my current role is doing the cap stuff, the asset stuff. Like,
well, it's not just at Sportsnet either. Everyone steals your work. I'll let you know that right now.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like it's I would love to just be like that boy nice about the acquisition, but my role, unfortunately, is like, okay, let's put on the front office hat, because Matt can do the ex-player hat, you guys can do the coaching hat a little better and stuff. So it's like, all right, that's let's dust off the spreadsheets.
But also, and I mean, I don't know which of those hats this falls under. Like, I think part of it is like the coaching hat, part of it is the front office and like number crunching hat, but it's just worth noting, and I'm not saying this should affect the way that we think about or talk about this trade, but like, you know, for anyone being like, you know, Raptors fleeced or whatever, it's just worth noting that like the Pelicans were openly shopping Ingram for months, right? Like, he was out there. And maybe they could have gotten more for him before they had this disastrous season where he's played 18 games. But like, I think it's been pretty widely reported that there was like no market for him. So obviously, you know, like the reservations that I've had and expressed, it's like those were shared by, you know, 28 other teams.
Yeah.
And you know, the Raptors saying, well, you know, maybe whether they see something in him that those other teams don't, or they feel like they're positioned to take this dice roll in a way that those other teams aren't. Like, you know, they are breaking from the pack and saying we're willing to take this on. Like, they're like, the other teams didn't want a part of him.
And Raptors fans will understand this perfectly well, because Pascal, even though it's against the rules, these players on expiring contracts, they dictate quite heavily where they're going to be based on how those conversations go. I know Bobby said, oh yeah, in the last 24 hours, we talked to Ingram's team. I'm sure, but like the Heat were like, okay, Brandon Ingram, what is this? And they ultimately decided like, juice not worth the squeeze. The Atlanta Hawks, the Raptors outbid them, or Ingram decided like the perspective of getting paid in Toronto seems like it's going to net me more than in, you know, Atlanta. In his welcome to Toronto thing, he said, let's get to this money. You know what I mean? It's a great double entendre. I know, Joe, you said perhaps a single entendre, but the Raptors, it's a trust thing. For sure, it's a trust thing, but it's true. Like, Ingram was available to a wide array of teams. It's not the full 30, because however many teams are able to bring him into their cap sheet, et cetera, or make it work like that. But, you know, the Raptors are the team that took a chance. Sometimes that's a really good thing. It really is. Like, teams have been taking a chance on DeMar DeRozan, and in my mind, getting surplus value for like 4 or 5 years at this point. It doesn't mean you win a championship, but teams haven't had to pivot off of DeMar in a painful way, and he's definitely made teams better. And like Ingram doesn't even ruin the tank, because and this is a joke I made to S, so I don't feel bad saying it. He's milking a sprained ankle for months, man. He's taking it for all it's worth. Blake, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, not necessarily. You know, it is what you just laid out is interesting. I would be fascinated to be a fly on the wall for these negotiations, where the Raptors could very much say, look, man, exactly what you just said. You were on the trading block for months, and you know, very few teams had interested in you at this level. We did. And like, you also look around, and the only teams that project to have like meaningful cap space to pry them away are really bad ones. And maybe Brooklyn or Washington or Charlotte land Cooper Flag and make another move, and suddenly that looks differently. But like, if your other options, you know, if your next best alternative is, hey, go be Kyle Kuzma in Washington, you know, like that's not that's not super interesting. And yeah, there are sign and trade possibilities and stuff like that. But the Raptors can say all that stuff to Ingram's camp, and then Ingram's camp can be like, you just traded a first round pick and a second round pick for this guy, and like you have no path to cap space if he walks, because of Scotty's extension and quickly and stuff, you would only have about 10-12 million in cap space even without Ingram. So it would be fascinating. Now that only happens if the two sides aren't close, right? But if it would be really interesting to hear kind of how that plays out. And I guess we'll see with the final number, but it seems on paper the Raptors have lots of leverage, and then Ingram's camp could just be like, okay, well, you gave up a first and a second and he walked, and you have no cap space to sign anyone else.
Which is the downside of like the pre-agency strategy.
Yes.
Right? Like they put themselves in that position with Pirtle as well. So
yeah. And
Pirtle
then
wasn't so bad.
The Pirtle relationship is obviously really strong, and like we'll probably hear things about an extension this summer when he becomes eligible and stuff. But also, like, you look at the center market around the league, everyone wants a good center, but there aren't that many non-star center who get 20 million a year. So it's not like they got Jakob's bird rights and then got him on like a crazy good deal. Even Kelly, who they did the pre-agency thing with, they gave him an extension that almost immediately they were looking to get off of. The Thad Young one was a little different. Like they overpaid Thad as well, but that was like partially to make him like a human trade exception, like kind of KJ Martin style. So that one's less bad. But yeah, they haven't, it's not like they got crazy discounts on these.
That is interesting. Like this Raptors team, Scotty has the potential to be the home run on the rookie scale, max extension. But like a lot of the best teams have a guy like the Raptors. The Raptors' whole franchise, when it's been successful, the same way the Warriors, is built off of a point guard who's just not getting as much money as he should be. And the Raptors currently, you look at this roster and try and be like, who isn't getting enough money? Everyone is getting their money. And there's very few teams that succeed that way, as bad as it is, because you want everyone to get paid. But the Raptors currently have like no home run. This guy makes like $7 million a year, but he's worth like 30. They don't have Malik Monk, who why the hell did he only sign for 18 when he was clearly worth like 26 and up at the very least? There's no big home run contracts on the Raptors, and I don't even know if they have an avenue to a bunch. However, they should be able to pivot away, I think is the thankful aspect of it. But Joe, final thoughts before we get out of here.
I think I've said all I came here to say. So, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. And Sam, thanks for having me on, man.
Of course. How's it feel to stretch the podcast legs out?
It feels great. I've honestly missed this so much. Like I've been on with Blake maybe a couple times. But I definitely miss doing it. And it's great to jump in and talk through all this stuff.
We're looking for a third chair on the Pull Up Tray podcast. We just won't be paying. I'm so sorry. We're up against the second apron, but feel free.
Anti-labor Samson Folk.
Yeah. Oh geez. All these years of pro labor.
I think all the Raptors players are getting too much money.
Yeah, exactly. It's you made the Dostoevsky or reference earlier, Blake. It's you've betrayed yourself, and the worst part is you've done it for nothing. I believe that's what the saying is. All right. Make sure to listeners, make sure to like the video before you get out of here. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. It helps the channel. It helps promote the show going forward. Audio listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I guess you could leave a review if people still do that on Apple Podcasts. I don't know if that's still a thing, but thank you so much to Joe. Thank you so much to Blake. Thank you, listeners. And whether you got into this in the morning or at night, have a blessed day and goodbye.